Hello, and welcome to our webinar, ESG, a Business Imperative. I want to thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to present this information. I'm Lynn Bergeson. I'm going to serve as your moderator for our conversation today. I am thrilled that we have two senior managing directors from FTI Consulting with us to talk about ESG today. Bergeson Campbell has partnered on a number of projects with FTI Consulting, and I know this for sure. They are very good at what they do, and they are incredibly gifted at soliciting and analyzing large quantities of data. Now, just a couple of administrative notions for you this morning. Number one, you are in listen-only mode. Number two, you should have received a copy of our PowerPoint. And importantly, in the PowerPoint, you will notice in the back a number of very, very helpful handouts from FTI Consulting. So not now, but after the program, I would urge you to take a look at those resources. They're very, very helpful. And then finally, if you have a question that you would like to direct to our presenters today, please use the portal on your GoToWebinar dashboard. Any question that you send, we will make every effort to respond to in the moment, okay? So moving on to slide 2, our topic is today, of course, ESG, a topic that we hear a great deal about, I think now more than ever. Environmental, social, and governance is a broad piece of real estate, and we're going to drill down today about what it means now. Our presenters are just top-notch in their field. Christine DiBartolo. Christine is a managing director with FTI Consulting, head of their corporate reputational practice. In addition to addressing ESG and corporate social responsibility issues, Christine also addresses strategic planning and a wide variety of corporate governance issues. Joining Christine is Ken Ditzel, whom I have known for a long, long time. He is a master of statistical models and data management, and he deploys those skills in a wide variety of contexts, including market analysis, and counsels his clients accordingly. Now, we're going to address 3 broad topics today. First, undertaking an ESG assessment. You got to start somewhere. And then building on that assessment, how do you get to a good, effective ESG program? And then finally, how do you build credible sustainability reporting systems? A word of background on ESG fundamentals. You know, the concept generally is rooted in the belief that companies, both privately held and public companies, serve a social purpose. This in turn grew out of broad investment policies rooted in the twin concepts of sustainability and socially responsible investing. Now, ESG obviously invites 3 broad categories: environmental, involving greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint, biodiversity, and other environmental metrics of one form or another. Social, which really is rooted in more workplace practices, labor standards, sexual harassment policies, wages and benefits, and more workplace-oriented concepts. And the third concept and category, governance, relates to corporate board structure, composition of board members, management, executive compensation, bribery, corruption, and other kind of corporate themes. I think over the last several years, we have seen a number of emerging themes as to what these concepts mean, but there is still a great deal of, well, not a lack of clarity, but a great deal of ambiguity as to how do you address these concepts in the real world, in your business operations, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to now turn the program over to Christine and Ken, who will engage in a conversation about these categories of topics. What is ESG and why is it a business imperative? And we really do mean that. It is a business imperative. How do you begin? If you do not now engage in this broad area specifically, how do you begin that process? And how do you conduct an ESG assessment? And then what makes an ESG program successful? building on the concept of metrics and measuring them to enable one to progress a system that has definable benefits and attributes is not easy, but Ken and Christine are here to talk about precisely how to do that. And finally, how does one balance the risks and opportunities of going down this road? So I'm going to turn it over to Ken and Christine to get the party started.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Sure, go ahead. I wanted to just ask you, why is ESG, in your view, Christine and Ken, a business imperative?
Yep, it's a great place to start, and I apologize. My screen may be frozen. I'll figure out how to unfreeze my face as we go through. Probably not when I'm talking. I don't know if I'm coordinated enough to do that. But I would say, I think at the heart of the question of why ESG, we really get down to three core business outcomes that our clients are looking for, right? Every business is trying to drive value. They're trying to minimize or mitigate risk, and generally they're trying to align or engage with key stakeholders. So when we think about ESG as a business imperative in the context of all of those three things, they're defined differently by every company. And what's so interesting right now is there's a lot of vernacular that is interchangeable. People talk about ESG, they talk about sustainability, they talk about social purpose and CSR and lots of other things. And we do see that for us, when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about creating long-term value while also caring for people and the planet and serving the interests of all your stakeholders, right? And within that broad context of sustainability, there are really kind of two categories, right? There's ESG, which is very quantitatively focused, right? It's rooted in materiality. It's thinking about protecting and enhancing enterprise value, making sure you're disclosing information, making sure that you can evaluate growth and risk profiles, right? Making sure, and this is where Ken can go into great detail, thinking about a go-forward strategy rooted in data as well as business priorities. And then you have on the same, equally important, but on the other side of the token is corporate citizenship and social responsibility, which is more qualitative in nature. And it's talking about your responsibility as an organization to a variety of stakeholders, whether they are your employees, your communities, your investors, whatever that group is. And really thinking about some of those more social impact types of issues, right? So it's not as data driven, it's more qualitative. But at the core of all of that, which is so, again, uniquely different for each company, is how a company defines its purpose, its mission, its value. How does it operate? How does it say it's going to operate? And how do all of those things really align and match together? So when we think about ESG in particular, the E, the S, and the G each stand for something very specific, but often as companies are implementing strategies and really thinking about disclosing against those, there's a lot of convergence, right? So when we think about this notion of environmental justice, for example, that lots of people are talking about, in part because regulators are also talking about it. There is certainly an element within the E category, right, in terms of factually data-driven what is happening, but it's also elements of the S, which is about community engagement. It's about how it's impacting a local environment. So many times in the context of developing an ESG strategy, we think about these in pillars as it relates to risk and data, but also we're thinking about how they converge so that we can ensure that any company that we're working with is understanding how to move forward and to operate. Health and safety is yet another one of these issues where you've got some of it is within the S category, others is within the G because of governance and policies and procedures. So, you know, at any point, no matter where you are in your journey, I think the thing that is so interesting about this moment that we're in is that a company needs to be authentic and credible, and you need to start where you're at, right? What we see oftentimes in terms of the risks associated with this is an enhanced moment of disclosure and transparency really does open up a company to articulate some incremental opportunities to improve over time. And that's really important. So we know that it's every company is in a different place. Some folks are further than others on a particular element of ESG. or they're behind on others. And so for us, it's really making sure that each company understands the group that they need to influence in any particular way. Again, they have a variety of stakeholders, and really thinking about how the expectations have changed. So, for example, we did some really interesting research among institutional investors as well as working professionals to understand what role does the CEO of a company, for example, how has their job description changed over time, and to what extent does ESG and sustainability need to play into that? What are those expectations? And what's really interesting is, institutional investors, just as much as professionals, really do see and expect CEOs and corporate leaders to talk about these issues. They understand that it is part of the expectation to deliver long-term value. And it really does, in fact, serve the bottom line and the interests of various stakeholders. So it's a really interesting moment. So that question of why ESG, while defined a little bit differently for folks, is certainly important. And I know, Ken, you've got a point of view on that as well.
I do. And from a business imperative standpoint, what you have to think about for companies is that there are social pressures. There's regulatory pressures from the SEC with the proposed SEC disclosure rule. And then also there are business opportunities when you think about particularly the E side of things. So E, obviously environmental, and a lot of that environmental focus has been on reducing greenhouse gas emissions because of those three sets of pressures. For example, we recently did a scope 1 to 3 assessment for a company that provides aviation logistics around the world. That company has about 3 different systems operating across its universe of its fleet. And within that system, they had difficulties with obtaining the necessary information of doing the scope 1 to 3 because they were all different. They reported differently. Even at the central headquarters, folks did not understand quite how all those different systems interacted. And from a business perspective, you can see that there's obviously savings to be had by combining systems into one single system. There's productivity and efficiency improvements that companies can obtain by training personnel on one system. And then there's also savings from monitoring the assets that they have. So when you think about aircraft and as they age over time, their efficiencies decline. There are ways to kind of consolidate maintenance and think about moving forward towards like a single type of aircraft, for example, that may be consistent throughout the world, that they can move parts around. So there are a lot of kind of business opportunities beyond just what I would say the kind of the social pressures out there and the regulatory pressures.
Mm-hmm. Great. Anything else you'd like to add to that component? Because I just wanted to circle back on a couple of things that you both kind of mentioned indirectly, and that is, it sounds like a lot of the different components that you mentioned, Christine, and the practices that you mentioned, Ken, on behalf of the aviation entity, rely upon very traditional business practices and procedures. But ESG has an aspirational goal to it. So it's more than merely optimizing existing functionalities. It's, to me anyway, it seems to be trending them in a direction to achieve a higher goal. Is that too subjective an assessment of ESG, or is that ESG patina exactly right, that there ought to be a higher social goal and you're simply not optimizing existing practices to achieve, greater corporate growth or efficiency? These are objectives and they're important ones, but how does ESG and optimizing existing functionalities align?
Yeah, Ken, I don't know if you want to jump in. I'm happy to as well.
Well, why don't you go first and I'll follow up.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Because every company, Lynn, is at a different point of maturity, I think there are some companies where that does align, right? I think other times it's a journey to get there. But I do think the ability to engage and have a more meaningful ESG strategy and program that includes goals, KPIs, disclosures, and a sense of engagement and transparency does in fact enable a company to align with that, right? And again, part of why we always say the foundation of all of this is a company's purpose and a company's values, right? And I think what we're seeing now, and the reason we talk about sustainability as an umbrella that includes both qualitative and quantitative inputs, is because it's very hard for people to disassociate words and actions from data and reporting. And so what we are seeing is a level of alignment, because at the end of the day, for every business, you know, if you want to elicit a particular behavior from a stakeholder, whether it's an employee, an investor, a partner, commercial partners, whatever that might be, data is part of it, but it really is also how you engage with them. So that alignment is really critical. And you know, by virtue what those particular issues are, they're things that a company is talking about anyway. We're just helping to align them to make sure that we're driving value around those issues, and more importantly, identify potential business risks so that they can deal with them in the future.
Great, thank you. Ken, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that a lot of the processes and frameworks out there for ESG assessment, especially around the E, are extremely valuable to companies because they help them with planning and creating their strategy. So, for example, you have the TCFD framework analysis, where you look at different scenarios and how the world might evolve over time, and where your company might fit in those worlds in a kind of do-nothing case, or a case where a company kind of sees red flags or opportunities and transitions into that new scenario. As we all know, we're never in a scenario forever. We're not going to be in high oil and gas prices forever. Eventually, they'll come down. The solution to high gas prices and fossil fuel prices is always high prices. We'll see more energy efficiency, more movement towards renewables, et cetera. There's another process out there which I can go into more detail about, but it's called the Science-Based Technology Initiative, and that allows companies to set near-term and long-term targets to eventually reach net zero. It's a very kind of methodical process, but at the same time, it offers a lot of flexibility within that process for companies to reach those goals according to kind of how their company is set up and designed.
Right. Great background on all of the above, but where to begin? Let's say you're talking to a client or a company that really wants to engage on this topic. How do you conduct, either on your own or with help, an ESG assessment? Christine, let's begin with you.
Yeah, it's a good question, Lynn. And again, because every company is at a different place, I think our starting point in any assessment is to understand your current state. I think we are hearing quite a bit from a number of organizations on this question of greenwashing or ESG integrity, and sort of how do we align what a company says with what it does. And for us, the most important element of any ESG program is the fact that it is credible, it is authentic, and it is something that is actionable for every organization. And so for us, the first step is to first identify, what are you doing? Where are you? Where are the vulnerable parts of your business? Where are the opportunities for you to lead within either your industry, your community, whatever that is? And to really understand who are the stakeholders that you are trying to influence and engage with, and really understand, what do they expect of you? So again, going back to that research I mentioned, you know, different stakeholder groups want different things from an organization. And so if you're a company that has investors, there are certain things that they are expecting, but that's quite different, for example, than your local community leader or your employees. And so what we're really trying to understand, knowing that it is a complex system that includes lots of different things, is, where do you start? What are you doing today that gives you a platform? And what we find, Lynn, often is during these assessments, there's more there than you realize. So for example, you might have health and safety programs already happening, which give you already something to talk about. There may be policies and procedures you need to implement over time, that's fine. But really we want you to start where you're at and to demonstrate incremental improvement over time, because at the end of the day, what rating agencies are looking for, what other organizations are looking for, is your ability to implement improvements against those particular metrics and KPIs. And so again, the starting point is figuring out your current state, determining maybe what your aspirational goals are, but making sure that they are credible, that they are authentic, that we understand what is your point of differentiation. So it goes back to the why ESG. We know in a lot of times our clients are coming to us because they feel like they're not getting enough recognition, and maybe a competitor is getting more recognition than them, when in fact company A is doing more. Some of that is just figuring out what is your white space, what is your area to discuss, improve, lead, so that you can engage with people in a more meaningful way. Of course, there's lots of more tactical stuff. So Ken, I know you want to jump in here too, but I would say the most important piece of the assessment, Lynn, are two things. One, where do you stand today so that it's real and believable? And two, who are the audiences you need to engage with, and what do they expect of you? So the first step is really figuring out what do they expect, and then how do you meet those expectations moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Super helpful. Ken?
Yeah, and I would just add to that knowing where you are is extremely important. And one way of doing that is benchmarking against competitors. So understanding where competitors are relative to you. Second, I would say setting long-term goals. I mentioned some of the frameworks that help that, particularly SBTI. TCFD also helps in terms of setting goals and a lot of the strategy around achieving those goals. And in that process too, you'll also want to benchmark. So competitors will have goals out there, let's say net zero by 2030, 2035, maybe SBTI by 2050. How are they achieving those goals? Should you be achieving them in the same way? Do you want to exceed what your competitors are doing, or you simply want to match? What is it that you need to do to kind of engage your stakeholders and help them realize that you are actually moving forward and taking the initiative to improve yourself on your emission side, and then also on the S&G side. And of course, it's not just long-term goals, but it's also setting those interim goals in between.
You know, with regard to kind of assessing what you already have, and I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar the three broad categories. Taking the E, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint, biodiversity. I'm guessing, but I don't know, if there is a defined kind of set already of metrics within each of the letters that members of our listening audience might be looking to identify what is the base there. If you're starting out fresh and wanting to identify all of the different categories and activities within ESG, is there a finite set, or do you rely upon a pre-existing list, or is it pretty much whatever you are comfortable in identifying, knowing that it needs to be authentic, it needs to be credible, and it needs to be something that you can assess progress against? But are there defined elements within each of the letters, or is it whatever you wish there to be?
There's an element of what you wish it to be, but I think there's also just a general element of knowing what others expect of you. So when you think of E, it's just not emissions and not just greenhouse gas emissions. It's criteria pollutants, other air emissions. It's also water and soil, right? So those are the three main elements of the E part of ESG, and you really should be tackling them all. Now, I know there's a lot of emphasis on greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously that's a good thing because it does address some of the other parts of the E. When you think of renewables, wind and solar, energy storage, there's not a lot of water consumption, right? Obviously none in the actual operation of those units, to very little. And then there's obviously water in the supply chain that's being used. But you reduce the water, you also are not producing the criteria pollutants. So focusing mainly on GHGs is not necessarily a bad thing, but companies need to remember there's more to E than just greenhouse gas emissions reductions. There's the circularity component. There's reducing landfill waste. How your consumers end up using your product, or are there ways that they can kind of reduce the packaging element of it, how much material actually goes into the product, the efficiency of the product. All those things kind of add up. And again, GHG is a great place to start because it touches on a lot of those things, but it's ultimately not the entire E part of ESG.
Yeah, and I would say, Lynn, when we are engaging in that assessment piece, there are literally hundreds of things, hundreds of topics that a company can report against. And what we tend to do then is condense that into probably 12 or 15 that are most relevant as a result of figuring out what the stakeholder expectations are. Now, there are some industry norms, right? So what we will do is take a look at, again, to Ken's point, benchmark against your peers. What are they reporting against? Because at a minimum, they are now setting table stakes for your industry and your peer set. The rating agencies have certain expectations of certain industries. So if you are in agriculture, for example, you may go heavier on water management, other sorts of things, soil management. Whereas if you are in a different kind of business like professional services, right? You're not thinking about that as much as you're thinking about travel and employee travel and those sorts of things. So there are hundreds of things that you could report on, but there's a very finite set of things that your stakeholders actually care about, and that's where you start. Now, if you want to report against 100 things, you're more than welcome to. It's overwhelming, it's labor intensive, and probably not the thing you do right out of the gate, but we do make sure that we're looking at industry norms. We're assessing what the rating agencies are expecting of you, because what's happening with the rating agencies, is they have a certain criteria that they're looking. And if you are not disclosing that information, it's not easy to find, it's not discoverable on your website or in some sort of reporting exercise that you have, they'll assume it doesn't exist. So some of this is us really helping our clients determine what are those critical factors. How do we help you disclose them in a way that enables your stakeholders to understand, but also from a rating agency's perspective, really understanding what are their expectations and how are you meeting those needs? Because we do know that the rating agencies, will obviously be a source of input and assessment against a company's progress that are really important to manage.
Excellent. No, that's super helpful. I mean, it sounds like the rating agencies are important in identifying areas that you might not otherwise think about. And it also sounds like there's a great deal of variation in what elements are going to be most important within your particular sector. So it sounds like there are hundreds of different aspects to consider, but what might be prioritized might be a more sector by sector analysis, public versus private, service versus manufacturing. So that's a great way of looking at it. Maybe we can pivot now to trying to define success. What are the elements that make an ESG program or approach successful? Ken, you want to start us on that?
Absolutely. Well, one of the most important parts, obviously, is assembling the right staff and set of advisors. Most large companies are going to need a head of ESG to direct all the work that needs to be done in the process. It's a large amount of work to get through an ESG report from the start to the end. Beyond that, it really just depends on the company's amount of resources available to support and also the size of the company. Ideally, you would like to see someone that supports the head of ESG on the E side, and then at least someone on the S and G. And then from there, again, it just depends on whether or not you can pull in resources from other parts of the firm that might be able to support on the E side, that know a lot about emissions and reduction targets, how to achieve reductions, for example. Same for the S and G. And then, Christine, I think you might want to add a little bit there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Lynn, some of this really depends on the expectations that each company has, right? So if it is a organization that's just starting, we want to make sure that we're tempering expectations in what success looks like. Success for some companies could be the fact that they've just issued a sustainability report for the first time, and they now have content that is, that they're disclosing, and that they've got a set of goals and KPIs to work against. For others that have a more mature journey and have been doing this for some time, it could be that they're looking for greater recognition. They're getting greater integration with a variety of stakeholders. I think ultimately, when I think about where we are today, even versus where we are 2 years ago, another really important element of success is that an ESG strategy is not a strategy unto itself. ESG is part of your business strategy. So to the extent that you can integrate all of the elements of ESG, which again are elements of your business strategy to begin with, when you think about your supply chain, your policies and procedures, your data management policies and how you're doing, how you're managing the environment, how are you managing human capital, all of those sorts of things are elements of your business strategy and are things that you should be addressing. And what ESG does is it enables you to really combine all of those things in an opportunity to think about value, to think about risk, but to really integrate it into whatever business strategy you have. So you don't need two separate strategies. You need a strategy that is incorporating ESG seamlessly. So whether you're a publicly traded company and you've got earnings, you should be talking about it there. If you are held by private equity, you have opportunities to communicate these things as well. So to me, a real point of success and a level of maturity is to make sure that the organization sees ESG and sustainability as a fundamental element of its business strategy, because you really cannot disassociate either of those things anymore, because the landscape that they each cover overlaps so much.
Mm-hmm. Ken, you mentioned, the issuance of an ESG report. If you're just starting this out, for example, and you haven't issued or undertaken an ESG assessment, do you typically, issue that once the assessment is completed and then try to build upon that on an annual basis, on an every other year basis? Is there a cadence to how often assessments are reported out? Annually, I imagine, is a pretty common metric, but not necessarily, right?
It is a very common metric to do it annually. Now, ultimately, it depends on the regulations, right? But right now, we don't have a regulation saying that you have to have an ESG report out every year. There are also rating agencies, financial institutions that may expect something to come out annually, so they can assess how you've progressed over time. So I would say generally an annual report is needed, but there could be circumstances where, depending on the size of the company, its resources, how it's changed over the last year, it may want to hold off and issue a report biannually, for example. But again, I think if there's a lot of pressure, both socially and financially, and maybe ultimately in a regulatory sense, pushing for an annual production of the ESG report.
And Christine, I would imagine the ESG assessment and ultimate report is very iterative. I can imagine that as we started maybe in the 2017, 18, 19 timeframe, and now we're at 2022, 23, that there are different aspects and components that will go into that assessment, because the area matures with each passing year. Is that a correct observation?
Yeah, it is. I think about, we've been doing variations of these reports for quite some time, and I think when 5 years ago, we called them CSR reports, right? Some people called them human capital reports. Then we had, elements of your annual report that included this. So I think it does change over time. Right now, what we're seeing in terms of a good report includes a heavy dose of data that's aligning to these various frameworks that companies need to work with. And then there's a heavy amount of narrative. I think what is so important for the engagement aspect of ESG is to make sure that data is not looked at in a vacuum. There is narrative storytelling that's really important, so that you can tell stakeholders and engage with folks and demonstrate progress, right? You can talk about a commitment to doing something, even if your data might not suggest it, because you can talk about in narrative format what you're going to be investing in the year ahead, what you consider your greatest accomplishments of the year that passed. And so right now what we're seeing, reports 5 or 6 years ago did not have a lot of data. You might have had an infographic on, some certain things, and now they're very heavy on data, but they also really do need to demonstrate progress. So it always goes back to incremental improvements. And so how is your report demonstrating improvement over time, and how are you making it useful? Even things as simple as the fact that ESG reports are often not printed anymore, right? We were still printing reports before. And so at its core, you can't even talk about some of these issues if you're still printing reports. So even just thinking about what is the interface in which you are reporting is also another really interesting conversation to have with companies, because people absorb information differently. So there's lots that goes into it, but it certainly continues to evolve over time for sure.
Yeah, I would second that as well. And it gets easier for companies over time as they issue the first report. Obviously, the hardest in getting over that hump. But as Christine said, you have to keep showing progress. But you have a base report to work from each year. I'll give another example where we were working with a particular oil and gas development company that really didn't know anything about TCFD analysis. They had done what I would call TCFD light in the past, and kind of looked at the potential for different worlds and addressed it very qualitatively, and mentioned some of the risks and opportunities. But this past year, they wanted to get into really the quant side of what is the risk for us. So we educated them further on the TCFD scenario analysis, different types of scenarios that are out there from different institutions, and then in the end gave them an opportunity to take a certain process and do the full TCFD, from analyzing those particular scenario worlds down to how does that affect their financial statements, and then further on into how that impacts their risk. And we laid that out for them with the opportunity for them to engage us further if they needed help with kind of the financial statement analysis. But they were in a good place, and they were able to do the analysis from the TCFD process that we had set up for them, and were quite successful. So it's building on every year and adding to and trying to show those incremental improvements while you're trying to meet those goals that you've laid out.
Thanks, Ken. That's a great example, and a wonderful segue to the next component of our conversation, which is balancing risks and opportunities. As a lawyer, I can see lots of opportunities to manage information in a way that always remains true to the goal of an ESG, to be authentic and transparent. And yet in harvesting information, there might be opportunities that you really wish you weren't committed to transparency, although you must be if you're going down this path. So how do you go about balancing those risks and opportunities? Christine, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this gets back to the very first element when we start to talk about that assessment, which is what is your current state and what are your risks, right? I think, again, for some on sort of the more quantitative side, ESG is a risk exercise because it does help identify areas of vulnerability within your business, whether it's because you don't have appropriate action being taken, or because you need policies and procedures, or maybe conversely because you're doing really well and you want to make sure you're feeding into that. But I do think there is a real balance in making sure that you know what is it that you're trying to achieve, and that gets to where are we today? Do we like where we're at? Is it acceptable, right? And where do we need to go? And to get to that point, you may need to lean in on things that you might not have leaned in on before, and that is uncomfortable. So I spend a lot of my time talking about the S elements of ESG, and I think within the last 24 to 36 months, the emphasis on those issues are quite different than they have been before, in part because we've seen, we've all gone through a pandemic where health and safety and employee and community engagement has been really critical. In the US in particular, we've seen quite a bit of emphasis on engagement with communities around broader social and societal issues, whether that's justice issues, whether it's other sorts of democracy related issues. So there's a very different emphasis, and those are historically not issues that companies and CEOs in particular have wanted to talk about or have been expected to talk about. So there is quite a bit of balance to think about. Here's where we're at, here's where we're going, here's the gap that we have to fill. Some of this may be stuff we're very comfortable with, but in the areas that there might be a level of corporate discomfort, you have to tread very carefully, because to your point, Lynn, as soon as you say something, you are going to be expected to act upon it. And so, you know, it's sort of that analogy of once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't put it back in. And so we are always really carefully calibrating, what do people actually need and expect of you? What do you have to say against that? And what is an appropriate goal moving forward, so that you're not creating additional risk, but you are demonstrating that incremental improvement over time, to what you were just saying.
And before I pivot over to you, Ken, to add to that, I'm expressing what is implicit in your remarks, Christine, and that is, you know, the commitment to engage in an assessment and then go forward with an ESG report needs to be nested at the highest elements of the company, the CEO, the board of directors, and I think it goes without saying that everyone needs to be on board and is singing from the same hymnal. Otherwise, you probably have a communication crisis of a different sort in the making. That's a fair statement?
It's a very fair statement. And in fact, we often have, you know, we've been in several situations where we've had clients say, now, how do I actually make my CEO care, right? There are others when you see, in part because that may be a CEO who's focused on the business, who's focused on growth, who's focused on revenue, which historically is exactly how a person becomes a CEO. But right now, the role of a CEO has changed. And I know that there's links that get to some of this research that I keep referring to. But, you know, undoubtedly what a CEO is being asked to talk about today is not what they were asked to talk about 5 years ago. So if you were the same CEO over that period of time, what you're expected to talk about is entirely different. And that's just different muscle memory for them to really think about. But what we tend to see in the most successful organizations, going back to that earlier question, Lynn, that you asked in terms of what does success look like, the companies that do it best are the companies who have buy-in and leadership at the very top, whether it's the CEO, whether it's the CFO, whether it's the COO, whatever that person's title may be. But at the highest levels of the company, if people see that this is a priority and it is in fact embedded in the strategy, you're very naturally going to be better at it, simply because it's integrated into your business. So yes, I think that's absolutely right what you're saying.
Great. Ken?
Yes, on the risks and opportunities, one thing I should mention is the SEC climate disclosure rule. That rule, a proposed rule, came out in March of this year, and would require companies to report scope 1 and 2 emissions, and potentially scope 3, but in most cases, I think that would happen because the rule proposes that it would have to be material. Material, for as one example, would be 40% of your emissions coming from scope 3. And a lot of the analyses that we've done and kind of benchmarking to others' analyses too, that scope 3 emissions are around 75 to even 90% sometimes of a firm's emissions. So the rule would apply to all the scope. There's been about 14,000 comments so far. Originally, the SEC said that they would come up with a final rule in October of this year, but kind of a lot of the rumors have been that it'll end up being early next year. So that is certainly a risk and opportunity. Likely is going to have some litigation around it, and really kind of the opportunity is for companies to get ahead of the rule itself. And again, there's rating agencies, there's the social pressure, maybe the eventual regulatory pressure, and just staying up with competitors. And so companies, I think, have to look at scope 1 to 3 as not something that's just regulatory, but there's other pressures and opportunities for them to address their emissions, reduce them, and in the end, ultimately find opportunities to save money and grow their business.
Great, thank you, Ken. I had no idea that there are many comments submitted on it, but that was a very controversial rule and continues to be debated in a lot of different contexts. We've talked a lot about things that, to be honest, I hadn't focused on before this conversation, so it's been hugely helpful. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more specifically about how you go about advising your clients on these topics. This is an area that is well trodden already, but continues to emerge. And there are lots of nooks and crannies that are not visible to those of us, not deeply embedded in this space. So, Christine, what are some of the things that people come to you for, and how do you help them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one of the things for those on the call who are not familiar with FTI, I think we are a little bit different than most consulting companies because we have sort of 5 core areas that deal with. One deals with corporate finance, another economics. I'm in strategic communications. We have folks who are doing forensic litigation, risk and investigations type work. We have lots of different types of people, and I think what generally people come to me with is, how do we navigate ESG and sustainability in the context of a lot of different demands from a lot of different people? It's alphabet soup out there. We have no idea how to manage all of this. Where do we start, right? To your point, and to some of the stuff that we just discussed, which is why I always have to, check myself on how deep I'm going into the details, because this is exactly what they're asking us. But I think what is so special and important about how we're counseling our clients is that ESG is not happening in a vacuum. It is very dynamic. So at one point, it's a regulatory issue. At another point, it's a financial issue. At another point, it's an employee issue, right? There are lots of different things at play. And so what we're trying to help our clients really understand is, how do you balance those tensions? So for us, ESG is not just, oh, we help you write reports, or, oh, we help you measure scope 3 emissions, right? We're looking at it in the broader context of, how do all of these things play together? And I think one of the greatest risks for companies is that they're taking a look at this myopically. They're looking at it, oh, this is a communications exercise, right? Or they're going to look at it as, this is a financial exercise. I need to start demonstrating this so that I can generate more investment. And what it really is all of those things. And so what we're trying to really understand at the root of it is, what are you trying to achieve from a business perspective? What are the risks you're trying to mitigate? And who do we bring in? So Ken and I do entirely different things. We have entirely different backgrounds, educations, work experience, but we work together all the time because our clients need both of those sets of expertise. And so for us, what's really important is for all of our clients not to just look at it as a single issue, but to really understand the scope of this, because what may be an employee issue today could be a regulatory issue tomorrow, or what is a regulatory issue today, if your industry is heavily regulated, could very easily be a community issue. And so the person who's managing law in reg is probably not the person who's managing community engagement. But guess what? They're going to have to talk, because some of that stuff is going to converge.
Very much so. Ken, what's your perspective?
Well, very well said, and I know we want to move to Q&A here soon, but I'll just say that one of the things I really enjoy about working at FTI is just that FTI, its breadth is quite comprehensive and provides an end-to-end solution on ESG. So I get to work with experts like Christine and others, and we probably have a couple hundred folks around the firm working on ESG, either partly or full time. And it's just a lot of fun to get plugged into these projects and kind of do the things that my team really likes to do, which is really focus on E side of things, particularly emissions, helping to set goals and create strategies, and fitting that into the kind of the broader offering that we have. And I would just advise companies that as they're going into considering outside advisors, that depending on where you are in the process, if you're pretty far along in ESG, you probably need a kind of boutique firm that can address certain things. But if you're just getting started or only a year or so into it, you really do need an end-to-end type of provider to kind of guide you through the process, because as Christine said, you're going to look at this myopically potentially, and you really kind of need to look at it holistically and look at it from the comms lens, the regulatory lens, the economics, the business growth lens, all those lenses, and that's what we kind of bring to the table.
No, exactly. And again, some degree of independent standards that can help you assess the integrity, the thoroughness, and the core competencies of your own ESG assessment. And Ken, thank you so much for keeping us on track, because we do have a lot of questions here. And if I may, I will begin asking them. Here's the first. I hear blockchain helps track ESG metrics. Is the technology getting to an acceptable level from the perspective of your activities? Christine, you first.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely are seeing the use of technology being leveraged much differently. So for example, we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help figure out, does the data match with the language and words? And so, absolutely the opportunity for us to leverage blockchain, other technology to ensure that companies can better assess, aggregate, review is absolutely something that is emerging. I wouldn't say we're there yet. I think there's lots of interesting things happening, but it absolutely, the use of technology to help us manage and assess situations, most importantly to ensure the integrity of a program, the integrity of the data, the integrity of commitments and progress are in fact happening is absolutely something that we're seeing as an emerging trend and something that's going to be really critical moving forward. Ken, I don't know if you've got more to add on that.
I would definitely agree with that in the use of AI. In the blockchain world, I've seen some use of that, particularly around the use of offsets and verifying those offsets and reducing kind of brokerage fees. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in terms of reducing the cost of transactions and complying with ESG and reducing scope emissions.
All right. Here's another question. How important is, in crafting your ESG program, alignment with the 17 goals of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Critical, important, or what do you think?
I think depending on what you do for a living, there are elements of those. Some are more important than others. So we are typically seeing clients who are aligning with certain elements of the UN SDG, maybe not all of them, again, depending on what they do, but we are very typically seeing that in addition to aligning with a particular framework, and I'm going to alphabet soup, whether it's the GRI, whether it's SASB, whether it's TCFD, whatever that might be, again, alphabet soup. One of the other important elements is figuring out of those, sustainability goals, right? The UN SDGs, which one are most appropriate. So we are regularly seeing alignment and reporting, in part because particularly for global multinational companies, those are things that are universally accepted and understood and globally. So we want to make sure that our clients are really thinking about that. Ken, I don't know if you've got some thoughts on that too from your perspective.
Yeah, I would just go back to what you've said earlier, that really, comes down to what stakeholders need to see from you, and that those are really kind of the elements in the end that matter most. While it is important if you're following a certain framework to address those framework elements, in the end, again, it really comes down to what your stakeholders need to see from you.
Another question is, if there is an answer to this, which industry is ahead in ESG metrics deployment? Not that there's a race out there, but some sectors may be further along than others.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't think about it by industry, Ken. I'd be interested if you are thinking about it from an emissions perspective. There may be industries that are just naturally ahead of it because they've had to track and other things. I think we're seeing different levels of progress, not just by industry, but also by geographic region, right? In part because if, we're working with clients who may be domiciled in Europe, and so they're in a very different place than perhaps those that are domiciled in the US because they've got different disclosure rules. So I would say, I don't know that any industry is ahead. I think there are probably regulated industries that have had to think about this differently, so they're naturally at a different point. But I don't know that anyone is ahead per se, because it's not about being ahead. It's more about, independently, again, kind of demonstrating progress in building the broader sustainability profile of the company or the industry. I don't know, Ken, from your perspective, you may have a more defined point of view on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And as you mentioned, it really is about individuals, individual companies, looking at the metrics and comparing themselves across the industry as opposed to industries comparing themselves to other industries. But if I were to take my best guess as to what industry is furthest ahead, I would say a lot of the technology companies. Many of them for years have been on the what you would call the RE100 list, and have been addressing what I would call their 24/7 emissions. And I would say, in generally, they're further along. And also, I mean, in some respects, a little easier for them to address their emissions than, let's say, a highly intensive manufacturing operation, right? So it makes it a little bit easier. But so I would have to say that technology is probably the furthest ahead.
Okay. Another question, and this is probably particularly relevant to multinational entities. How are ESG programs either aligned or are they divergent when it comes to different geographic regions? For example, the US ESG approach, is it largely aligned with the European model or approach versus South and Central American, Canadian? How much diversity is there in developing these programs, particularly if you're a global entity?
Ken, do you want to start? Because I think the E is something that's a little more defined than some of the other issues globally.
I would agree there that there are frameworks, I mentioned SBTI before, that allow you, and it really applies internationally, so it just crosses all borders, and that provide frameworks for you to reduce your emissions by a certain period in the short term, long term. So on the E side of things, I think there are a lot of similarities across different geographic regions pertaining just to the E. As it pertains to the entire ESG reporting process and the frameworks around that, I think that's quite different and disparate. Christine, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. It's one of the challenges that our multinational clients are facing, Lynn, to your point, in part because if you are, again, if you've got operations or domiciled in a particular place in Europe, you've got mandatory disclosures there that you don't have here, right? Or if your headquarters is here, but you have operations in other parts of the world, it's very different. And certainly there are emerging markets in the world who have different environmental standards, just simply because they're at a different place. So it's very difficult. It's not easy, but it is why within the last, I'd say, year or so, you've seen greater alignment. There are now movements to try to align various disclosures, rules, other sorts of things, different ratings. So they're trying to figure that out, but we're not there yet. We are still a bit away from having a sense of global universal alignment. So it's still going to be a little bit of, again, the ability to be nimble and dynamic is really important for any company because the winds change. We've even seen the winds change here in the US as, some of these issues, which a year ago we could very easily talk about in any setting, are now even, they're now political as opposed to policy driven, right? So the winds continue to change. And so, you know, staying true to what you need to do, who you are, what you're trying to accomplish is really important. Just keeping that North Star despite the shifting winds, so that you continue to think about, what does this mean for my business? What does it mean for our bottom line? What does it mean for our people, for the communities in which we operate? And that tends to at least enable companies to find a way through that clutter that we're seeing now.
Right. Well stated, Christine. And I regret that we are at our 1 hour mark, and I feel like we have just scratched the surface. This is such a fascinating topic, and judging from the questions that are coming in, which we cannot address all of them, we definitely hit upon a topic that is resonating with many of you. So I'd like to thank you, Christine and Ken, for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, and your insights with us. Remind our audience that the resources that are listed here and available in your go-to portal there under the resources section provide additional guidance on these very interesting and fast-changing topics. I know we used a lot of acronyms, and many of them are defined in the materials that are available for your review after the webinar. So forgive me for not asking for an explanation of each of those acronyms, because I know it's tough slogging to try to keep them all together. This is an area prone to alphabet soup, as Christine mentioned. And the recording of this will be available in a day or so, so feel free to listen up again. And we hope you found this interesting and helpful. And again, allow me to thank Christine and Ken for a wonderful discussion on a very important topic. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Bye.
Great. Lynn, thanks so much for having us.
Yep,
My
thank
pleasure.
you. Take care.
Bye-bye.